Hi, it's Roz, and I said I'd be trying to get things back to normal a bit in terms of what I do on BookTube. So here's a proper scallydandling video, reading a book from a country that I've never read a book from before, and trying to take us all a bit further afield than perhaps we sometimes read. So this is Told by Starlight in Chad by Joseph Brahim Seid. And it's a slim volume of short stories by a writer from the Central African country of Chad. So Chad, if you don't know, and it's not the most well-known of countries, I guess, is, if you imagine Africa, it's kind of in the sort of middle of the top, slightly to the right. So it's a landlocked country. Above it is Libya. You've got Sudan to the right, Niger and Nigeria to the left, Cameroon, Central African Republic, I think, below it. So yeah, kind of in there. And it's one of those countries that has like kind of Mali or Niger or whatever, that has like a top half that is like Sahara desert, and a bottom bit that is equatorial savannah and forests, and a bit in between that is what's called the Sahel, which is a sort of transitional climate zone between Sahara and the sort of more sort of tropical, not quite equatorial, actually tropical kind of environment. Interesting country. It's one of those countries where its sort of borders were invented when, like, by European imperial colonialists. You know, there isn't a sort of it's an area that has a really interesting history, but it wasn't a historic kingdom of Chad or country. It's a kind of, it was a sort of artificial construct. It was like a chunk of what was French equatorial Africa kind of colony, and but that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have a really rich, interesting past. Obviously, various kingdoms there, particularly in the kind of what would we be in Europe we'd have thought of as medieval and sort of early modern times, and a lot of their power and significance came from the fact that they're that geographical position, so like controlling trade routes from sub-Saharan Africa through the Sahara to North Africa and the coast of the Mediterranean, so through to Libya and Egypt. So yeah, fascinating. Northern half is predominantly Muslim, southern part is more Christian, but also kind of traditional animist sort of African beliefs. The French took control in about 1900, and the author of this book, Seid, was born in 1927, so very much in the middle of the sort of French colonial times, and he was educated in French colonial schools in Chad and then in the Congo, and then in 1955, and he went and in Egypt. He was also educated in Cairo, but he got a BA in law at Lyon University in France, and was Chad's first university graduate, the first person from Chad to get a degree, and that was in 1955. In 1960, Chad becomes independent. He actually becomes Chad's first ambassador to France, and then he mid-60s he goes to work in Chad's Ministry of Justice. He's I think the Minister of Justice up to one place I saw said 1975, another said 1978. He dies in 1980, so only 53. Now, it's quite hard to find much more than that about him. He wrote another book that was like a memoir, but it's only available in French, and actually I don't think it's now out of print. He obviously was part of the regime of the first sort of post-independence president. Chad has had a very checkered history since independence. that first president was deposed. I think basically they had about 24 years of civil war. The president, Habre, who was sort of from kind of in control from about 1979, so around the time that he is no longer working in the Ministry of Justice and just before he dies. He, by all accounts, was a bit of a monster. Ultimately, he has been prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Supposedly 40,000 people kind of killed by him. The current president of Chad took power in 1990, and although he's sort of introduced multi-party system and elections and so on, curiously he has actually been elected every time since and is still in 2020 the president. So kind of says it all, really. I don't know if you've heard of something called the Fragile States Index. Now, you can make a load of criticisms of it. It's a kind of slightly flawed Western system. I think it's an American NGO that kind of runs it, but basically they try and look at all the countries in the world and rate them each year on how sort of fragile or stable they are. And so at the top end, most stable, you've got Finland is kind of tops these days, but like other Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Australia, Canada, that's your sort of top end of this index. Bottom end of the index at the moment is Yemen, for obvious reasons. Also down there you've got like South Sudan, Syria. Chad is 7th, so the 7th rated as the 7th most fragile state in the world. Okay, so I think that even if that's a flawed kind of way of how it's assessed, I think it gives you the picture. So it's perhaps not surprising that it is not easy to get hold of anything to read from Chad. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there aren't sort of interesting literary traditions there. I mean, obviously there's a very strong oral tradition. When I was trying to hunt around to see what else I could find like available to read from Chad, the one thing I was able to find was a bit of poetry, and really interestingly, it's like like there's a fashion now for sort of performance poetry, like slam poetry competitions. Well, that's really taken off in Chad, it seems, and it's interesting how that kind of links back to older oral traditions. So yeah, maybe people, and you don't need to like access to getting your work printed or whatever, if it's like a living and immediate kind of way of having a kind of literary experience. So what about this book, which is what I could get? Oh, I should say I did manage to find a few poems which I sort of struggled through with my schoolgirl French and a bit of help from Google Translate when I was sort of missing words. But there's nothing else. There's nothing else that you can really lay your hands on. This book in itself, it's not amazing. I think he published it in 1962, but the translation is really new, 2007 I think I said, and the translator is she's from Ireland originally, but she now works at a university in South Africa, and she's an academic, and her academic interests include African literature, so she has done us a real service in translating this book, but she's not a professional translator. And it really shows sometimes. You get the beginnings of some stories, where it got a nice kind of epic or fable kind of style, and then it'll just sort of go off into something really banal and a really kind of uncomfortable kind of way of saying things. But I say, can't criticise her. It's great she managed to do this at all, so not going to complain about that. Now, this book very much comes from Chad's oral traditions, and Seid's quite kind of upfront about that. He's trying to celebrate, as he says, the evenings of his childhood when I'll actually say the drums reverberate, roar, summon to the dance. The young perform war dances, competing in strength, agility, and skill. The rhythm of life captivating, lyrical, spellbinding magic. With fertile protean imagination, griot and bard recite the prowess and deeds of their distant ancestors, or sing of the beauty and charms of their betrothed. Elders recount the most beautiful tales, which sometimes never end and must be resumed evening after the light of the moon. So was trying to kind of give some of Chad's traditional stories. Now, what is interesting is the way traditional stories from different cultures often have like overlapping kind of themes and characters. So some of the stories in this book there's some that are kind of like creation myths, like kind of world creation myth, or floods, that come up again and again, don't they, in different cultures. Origin myths for particular kind of like clans or tribes that kind of hark back to their ancestors. Retellings of historical figures kind of making kind of epic, so like the equivalent of King Arthur, or stories of like Richard the Lionheart, or so there's some of those in here. Stories that explain things, like there's a lovely story in here about the moon and the sun that explains why we have eclipses, and why people in Chad behave a certain way in eclipse to try and get the sun to stop obscuring the moon. You get that in lots of cultures, don't you, those sort of stories, but with a particular kind of like local overlay. Some of these stories are more like fairy tales, and you get those kind of fairy tale archetypes, like the wicked stepmother, the two children who are abandoned in the wood but come good eventually, like Hansel and Gretel. The woods, forests, they always come up in stories as kind of like dangerous places, don't they? And yeah, do in a few stories here. It's just that in these stories, you've got lions and hyenas and snakes in the forest rather than wolves and bears like you would in a sort of a European or American, say, folk tale. I got a lot of enjoyment from those, I think. There's one story that's like, it's a bit like Jack and the Beanstalk, no giants in it, but that thing where you get magical gifts and then you because you're a foolish young man, you squander them, but you manage to come good in the end. Or princesses whose hand has to be won by doing ridiculous good deeds, and you get that in Greek stories, or Icelandic sagas. These things come around, don't they? So lots of enjoyment in those, lots of things to recognise, and then also enjoy the difference, which I suppose is one of the things I like about reading things from places that are a long way from my own experience. I think it's interesting that he was writing these tales, obviously, as at a time when Chad was trying to kind of nation build. So I suppose he's deliberately harking back to Chad's traditions as part of that, trying to kind of make themselves give themselves a kind of cultural history and identity as a new nation in the 1960s. Obviously that then they then moved into a period of great difficulty and civil war, and you have the feeling, well, that there's hints of political thinking in this book, hints of stories that explore what is good government and what a good leader should do, at a point when perhaps that was sort of a very live issue in Chad, but he never makes that explicit. It's interesting, the last story in the book, and I presume that this translation is a translation of all the stories and that the stories are in the order that they were originally published, but I actually have no way of telling that, but I presume that they are. And the last story in this book is called The Misanthropic King. And this is like a tale back in time of a king, of a kingdom in Chad, who decided to give up his throne because he felt there was no way he could satisfy everybody and govern as well as he wanted to, perhaps, and he basically throws in the towel and hands it over to say to the people, he says, ask you, my people, to govern yourselves as you see fit. And I beg you to drop your ambitions and your vain pursuits and appoint in my place a citizen who can make you happy. And of course, it all goes rather wrong. And in the end, they ask the old king to come back and become king again. And this is a bit at the end, okay, where you feel like he's expressing some kind of political philosophy. The history of a people is indeed unbroken. It cannot be distorted. It cannot be truncated, much less extinguished by an ill-conceived act or by a policy tending to the cult of personality. It constitutes the only guarantee of a people's progress. Well, there's kind of like a really sad irony to that, in that, cult of personality is very much then what happened with all of Chad's presidents since he wrote that, and the people's progress in Chad has absolutely not been guaranteed. So, interesting little book. I'm glad I read it. I wouldn't kind of say, oh, rush out and get hold of this, it's the most amazing thing you've ever read, but it was certainly stimulating and got me to find out a lot more about Chad than I would otherwise have known, I guess. Have a good week.